Hi, everyone. My name is Sally Charno. I want to just shout out that everyone's talking about the election results came in, and if you haven't heard, which is probably impossible, 58% for Macron, 41% for Le Pen. We can take a collective sigh of relief and also recognize how much work there is to do around the world. So good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us today. Along with Judith, and my co-coordinator, we're delighted that you chose to come to French Presse, New Books in Francophone History. And today, Ian Coller will be talking about his new book, Muslims and Citizens, The French Revolution and Islam, came out of Yale University Press in 2020. And he'll be in conversation with Judith Surkis from Rutgers University. So just a couple of housekeeping notes before we begin. You've noted that for security reasons, we have kept your videos off. We have muted everyone except for the speakers, and we've disabled the chat until the Q&A. So when the discussion opens, the Q&A will be open, and we ask that you send your questions directly to Judith Surkis, who will sort of organize them and offer them up to you. So thanks again for joining, and I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Judy Coffin.
Hi, and welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for coming this afternoon. I get to introduce our commentator this afternoon, and it is a pleasure. She's my friend as well as my colleague. Judith has written first Sexing the Citizen, then Secularization and Sexuality, then Sex, Love, and Sovereignty, and now is working on a book called The Intimate Life of International Law. She's also well known for her article, for her nicely titled article, When Was the Linguistic Turn, in the AHR. And she's pointed out to me that a section of her new book is going to be previewed. Is it maybe the first chapter in the upcoming? What?
Yeah, it's a kind of summary of some of them.
It's one of those, right? It's one of those distillation chapters in the JMH this fall. And she has an NEH to work on that, and she's also going to be at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton in historical studies. So welcome, Judith. Welcome, Ian. Welcome, all of you. And Judith is going to introduce Ian more completely.
Well, thank you so much, Sally and Judy, for inviting me to be part of this wonderful forum that you run so well, and to Ian for giving us this occasion to meet and exchange on a obviously timely book. It's my pleasure to introduce Ian Coller, who is, as Sally noted, professor of history at UC Irvine. He's a specialist of 18th and 19th century France, modern Europe, and the Mediterranean. In addition to the book that we'll be discussing today, that is Muslims and Citizens, Islam, Politics, and the French Revolution, published by Yale University Press in 2020. Ian is the author of Arab France, Islam and the Making of Modern Europe, 1798 to 1831. So there are ways in which this book is sort of kind of a prequel to that previous book, which was published by the University of California in 2010. He is also the author of numerous articles and book chapters that shed light on the long history of interactions and exchanges, at once discursive and lived, between the north and southern sides of the Mediterranean. He more globally, offers provocative interventions into the history of revolution and empire, universalism and difference, race, religion, and secularism. And he's currently working on projects directly related to these themes on the history of race and revolution, on the police des Noirs in a broad European context, and a new global approach to the French Revolution. So I'm going to turn things over to Ian now, and then afterwards begin with a set of questions that hopefully could be a jumping off point for our discussion. So thank you so much, Ian.
Thanks, Judith, and thanks so much for agreeing to bring your wonderful expertise to into this conversation. I think it's really terrific, even though we kind of work on different subjects that are separated. There's so many connections between what we're doing and so many interesting new ways to I think about this material across the different dimensions that we've been exploring. I really also want to thank Sally and Judy for organizing this, and a shout out to Christine Haynes, who was one of the driving forces in pushing this forward. So I'm really grateful for that and for the opportunity to speak today, and to everyone for coming along. It's wonderful to see the list of names of friends and colleagues who are here, along with others who I've yet to meet. So this book seems to, I don't know, somehow coincide with big things happening in France and the world. And so I guess it was an unfortunate coincidence that the time of its release in March 2020 was exactly the moment when we were possibly very distracted from thinking about these kinds of questions with other things in front of us. And so today I was prepared for another strange and inexplicable event that could have occurred about an hour ago, but did not. But I still think that it is worth really thinking deeply about why it is that we find ourselves in the position of hearing that and feeling that it's so kind of close to us. And the ways in which, and I had prepared some remarks, and I'll be happy to talk about these later, but certainly I think it's really, really important. After the last election in which Macron won, I wrote an op-ed that I offered to the conversation and that they turned down, in which I said how Marine Le Pen had won the French election. And I think that process continues. No one wants to hear it. Everyone is so relieved to hear that the merely objectionable has defeated the unthinkable. But nonetheless, I think it's really, really important for us to be thinking about the ways in which the discourse of Marine Le Pen has moved from the extreme right to the center, and has started to occupy also the discourse of Emmanuel Macron, that he has taken up many elements that we would associate with right-wing talking points, and particularly in relation to Islam. So thinking about the election and worrying about the election has been very, I think, germane to the topics of my book, and thinking about them again, and you know, how they relate to what I was talking about in the book, which after all is about the late 18th century. I was really struck on Friday when there was a episode of The Daily about the French election, and the commentator, who was the journalist Roger Cohen, was talking about the 6 million Muslims in France and the reactions of French people to Muslims and to Islam, without a recognition that those 6 million Muslims are French people. They are not the object for French people to be thinking about. And this is one of the really fundamental problems of French politics today. A researcher at the University of Grenoble, Amel Boubacar, put it, I think, very well in saying there's a hyper-politicization of Islam in France, but Muslims are largely kept out of the conversation. And that is exactly what I found in my study of the French Revolution. So I want to take you through some of the key, just 5 key takeaways from the book, and I'll try to do that as quickly as we can so that we can get on to, I think, the most interesting part, which is having a conversation about these issues. So I'm going to share my screen. Let me just... You can all see that? Is that okay, Judith?
Great.
Yes, you can see it. Good. So the first thing that I want to say, I guess, about, and let me just take it back to the previous slide. First thing I want to say is that these questions go deeply to the original impetus for the book, which really was thinking about the French Revolution as the central element of the constitutive narrative of modern France, and what it means for these millions of Muslims who live in France today, and whether the questions about citizenship, about the republic, religion, secularism, identity, and so on were all worked out in a France without Muslims, right? For Muslims to later come into the conversation, if indeed they have been welcomed into the conversation at all. So I started to ask, were French revolutionaries conscious of Islam and Muslims? And if so, how did they conceive of the place for those categories within the revolution? Were Muslims themselves present in even small numbers in revolutionary France? Did they participate in revolutionary politics in France or outside? So these were my key interests in the book. So I just want to say quickly what the book is not. It is not a broad investigation of Muslim responses to the French Revolution or to the impact of the revolution in the Muslim world. And that definitely is work that really needs to be done, but that was not my primary question in this book. Nor is it an investigation into the history or the roots of laïcité, right? That rolls off the tongue of French commentators so readily. The particular form of French secularism, whose roots I would say are really at the end of the 19th century, although it is often back projected in ways that I think are quite inaccurate into the French Revolution, as I hope I'll be able to show. It is neither an exhaustive account of French representations of Muslims, nor is it a statistical survey of Muslim presence in France during this period. Instead, it is really centered on the intersection between the changing representations of Islam and the revolutionary participation of Muslims themselves. And it is really, I mean, it is a book about the French Revolution. It is trying to ask what this can reveal about the revolution itself. And in the process, I think it reveals my interpretation of the revolution, neither as a political crisis from on high percolating down, nor as an economic insurgency from below, but as a vast socio-cultural shift taking place across all levels and deeply connected into the wider global context. So this was a pretty huge undertaking that ended up with a fairly long book of 10 chapters that does really go from just before the revolution all the way through to just before the invasion of Egypt. And I guess there's maybe, if this is a prequel to my Arab France book, there's another book that needs to be written ultimately about this invasion of Egypt and the occupation of Egypt that really was so important in structuring French responses to the Muslim world. So I guess the first takeaway that I took from this research was that Muslims and Islam were indeed present in the minds of revolutionaries from the very outset, long before the summer of 1789, right? There were many cultural and ideological ways of thinking about Muslims that I kind of chart in the prologue to the book. But really, I start with the story, perhaps it's strange to see these echoes of the present in the past, but the story in some sense starts with the annexation of Crimea by Russia in 1783, which led to a new war between Russia and the Ottomans with the participation of Austria, which really then brought the French monarchy into connection with this war. But the Ottomans were a French ally, and many French people, as the Parisian bookseller Hardy expressed it, that the whole of Paris had turned Turk, he said, in their support for the Ottomans and their outrage against Russia. So the annexation of Crimea had a huge impact across the Muslim world, but also across Europe. I mean, as we're seeing today with the war in Ukraine and what we're seeing as a really profound shift in European and global politics as a result. But it wasn't just a question of the Ottomans. At the same time, the Muslim leader Tipu Sultan in India was also seeking French assistance. And so one of the things I chart in the early chapters is the presence of these ambassadors, these Muslim Indian ambassadors and Ottoman ambassadors in the France of the pre-revolution, and the way they were swept up into revolutionary debates. At this very same moment that on a religious level, a big shift was taking place in 1787. The shift for the first time in almost 100 years to recognize non-Catholics with the so-called Edict of Toleration of 1787. It was actually didn't really tolerate non-Catholics. It just recognized that they existed. But it was surrounded by new imaginings of a multi-faith France that would in many ways dilute the threat of Protestants, right? Those who were supporting this shift didn't want to make it about Protestants alone because they feared the return to these terribly divisive wars of the past. And at that very moment, and this I guess is one of those actions of coincidence in history, it happened to be the 100 years since the treaties with North African powers had been concluded in 1689. So these were up for renewal, and a very distracted monarchy had done very little to ensure that they were going to be renewed, which would was already exposing French shipping to piracy and to blockade in various ways, and worsening the subsistence crisis, as the controller of finances Necker noted in his essay about the subsistence crisis. So for multiple reasons, Muslims and Islam were present in that early revolutionary moment. By 1790, however, ways of thinking about Muslims had really shifted in powerful ways. And in part, this was the result of the events of 24th of December, 1789, when non-Catholics, and this was a big shift from what had happened in 1787, which had just recognized the existence of non-Catholics. Now, as a result of the revolution, non-Catholics were to be accorded the full eligibility for citizenship. And the question that arose immediately was whether non-Christians would also count in the eligibility of non-Catholics. So this was already a deeply politicized question, and Muslims were brought into the debate in really profound ways. I mean, directly, explicitly. In one sense, they were helping to, as we saw in 1787, they were helping to broaden the issue between the Catholic-Protestant split, but they were also invoked in a complicated way to try to block the extension of full rights to Jews, right? There was anxiety about, I think, the staging of an anxiety about violence being committed against Jews in the east of France if they were given full rights. But to temper the sense that this was some kind of attack on universalism, which was so profoundly part of the revolutionary set of beliefs, Muslims were then invoked as a category of non-Christians who could receive rights. So the strange thing at this moment was that Muslims were not the problematic religious minority. They were the ones who could represent universalism, but they were profoundly connected to thinking about Jews. But really, I guess the moment of shift for me was on the 19th of June, 1790, when the participation, as you can see here in this engraving, the participation of several men dressed in Muslim clothing in the deputation of foreigners to the National Assembly, helped to create the atmosphere of revolutionary enthusiasm, which then led later in the session to the abolition of all noble titles. And that might seem a small thing, but this was a vast shift symbolically and socially for France, right? This really was, for many people, the birth of the counter-revolution, the really kind of violent turn against the revolution by those who had been against. They had been against, but now they really became counter-revolutionaries coming out of the aristocracy and the church. Counter-revolutionaries denied that Muslims had participated in this deputation and attacked them as as actors dressed in theatrical costumes, and notably mixed these questions up with attacks on the people of color as being enslaved servants. But as a result of this deputation, I think we really see the way in which Muslims became a kind of symbol, a really powerful symbol of the global vocation of the revolution. And we see that being spread in images, pamphlets, speeches on the stage and in popular songs. But this is contested too. These ideas are contested too, and Muslim presence becomes even further politicized in 1791-2 in the struggle over the constitutional oath of the clergy. Conservative Catholics had initially resisted freedom of religion and fought for Catholic supremacy. Jews and Muslims become the focus of the pamphlets against the reorganization of the church. And there are all sorts of claims that I describe in the book of, them imagining how Muslims and Jews would be voting for cures and bishops, or even becoming bishops on their own. They would be building synagogues and mosques all over France. We see some of the kind of lurid extreme right rhetoric reflected in this moment. The strange thing I guess I found is that revolutionaries, instead of saying, but there aren't any Muslims, doubled down saying, well, exactly, right? We need to displace Catholicism, the Catholic Church, as the center of, for example, the births, deaths, and marriages, the état civil, and reject Catholicism as the dominant religion. And by 1792, I guess one strange thing to discover is that Catholics who had followed the Pope in rejecting the revolution, and we see actually this in an image of the Constitution here, the peasants looking at the Pope's encyclical telling them to reject the revolution. They were now using the example of Islam as an argument for their own right to practice a separate form of Catholic belief. And this religious crisis continued into the period that we have become accustomed to call the Terror, but many historians in recent times have questioned how this term came to be, and really consider it more appropriately as the period of emergency. And we see really profoundly different views of what Muslim inclusion might mean emerging in this period. Islam would be part of the new order of liberty, equality, and fraternity, but in what form? All faiths could be free, but can all faiths be equal? Islam was often viewed as a more rational religion. Could it be a model or a participant in a new deistic civic religion? On the other hand, radical de-Christianizers believed Muslims would and should abandon their faith along with Christians and Jews. So two really important things come out of, I think, out of this moment. We can recognize that the struggle over religion went much deeper in the French Revolution than we have imagined. This was not simply the birth of laïcité, a simple separation between church and state. This was a profound crisis over religion for which there was no simple answer. And this will continue on into the period that follows and really through the 19th century. What we do also find, however, is Muslims in France during this period articulating their revolutionary commitment themselves in their own voices through their religion, not in opposition to or despite their religion. But they make it very clear in the small amount of evidence that we have, we do see this articulation of revolutionary commitment through religion. And finally, the last takeaway is, I think, the importance that some of these ideas about Islam, some of these ideas that I think were mistaken about Islam, right? Not necessarily negative ideas, also positive ideas. We see here a picture of someone who was a young revolutionary in 1793-94, a refugee from Corsica called Napoleon Bonaparte, who would later obviously become known under the French form of his name. And he was very interested in Islam and was kind of fascinated by the possibilities that this apparent openness of Muslims towards Islam would offer. But what did this mean? Did it mean that Muslims could be revolutionized against their own societies, that they would all rise up in sympathy with the revolution? Or did it mean that Muslim states would be friendly to or support the revolution? And I think this was a real kind of quandary and there were profoundly different views of what this meant. But by the time after the fall of Robespierre, the leader during the emergency period, was really profoundly against any idea of trying to revolutionize Muslims. He really believed we should accept the support of Muslim states. They were more friendly than other European states. And down the line, we can think about those kinds of issues. But after the fall of Robespierre, we see the return of this kind of Girondin universalism that said, no, Muslims are also going to accept the revolution and rise up. And Napoleon Bonaparte seems to have believed this and was easily convinced to follow his great interest in power in leading the French army into Egypt. That ultimately led to the declaration of war by the Ottomans against France, this unprovoked invasion of Egypt, which was an Ottoman province, and to a declaration of jihad against France. And ultimately, I guess the last irony that I'll finish this section with is that the evidence that I found finally of one Muslim who really did become a citizen during the French Revolution only turned up because of this declaration of jihad against France and the French backlash against Muslims, which led the authorities to collect information on the Muslims in France and turned up this individual who had become a citizen. So to conclude, then, I guess, you know, as Boubacar, the researcher, says, the revolution too embraced Muslims in ways that politicized them or even hyper-politicized them without actually opening a space for real participation. And I think that has been a continuity in French history. So this story can offer us ways to think about greater inclusion, but it also needs to present us with a warning that even the best principles can be used to destructive ends. And I'll close there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So I guess I'm going to begin my questions with asking you to say more about what I think is a certain ambiguity in the book's title of Muslims and Citizens that I think actually is nicely captured by your introductory remarks about the 6 million French Muslims who are indeed French, right? And there's a way in which your title kind of poses the question of what is the relationship between the Muslim and the French revolutionary citizen, right? Are the Muslims invoked in the title also citizens? Are they inside or outside, integral or liminal to the body politic that is taking form at this moment? And how does their position vis-a-vis citizenship and the body politic change over the course of the revolution, right? And I think your overview really gives us a sense of how it is that you're kind of working on and working out to that problematic. So, I mean, I guess I'd sort of want to hear more about your sort of choice of title and the extent to which that was a sort of deliberate play or ambiguity that you were interested in foregrounding as kind of central to the argument of the book.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it is. It has that ambiguity, and I guess it expresses a fairly ambiguous field because, as you suggest, absolutely, this is something that is changing and that is very much contested across the period of the revolution. I guess one of the really important points that I would want to make is that commentators often oppose universalism and particularism as if universalism is a single and kind of clear quantity, when in fact universalism is very complex. And there are multiple universalism, and they are in struggle and in contestation during the revolution. And so that's really what I found on so many occasions, is that it was not, the inclusion of universalism versus the exclusion of nationalism or of religious prejudice, religious exclusivism. It was a struggle over what it actually meant to include people. At the same time, often the richness of that debate was actually really fascinating, in the sense that there was some kind of a they were confronted with the sense of the difference of and the contested nature of this kind of universalism. At the same time, as we know from the revolution itself, those struggles could lead to extreme violence, and people risked a great deal. At the end of 1793, those radical de-Christianizers who were giving speeches in which they were calling upon Christians, Jews, and Muslims to renounce their religion and worship nature, they went to the guillotine. So Anacharsis Clootz, the leader of the deputation of 1790, was among them. So I mean, these were very, very high stakes questions, and I guess the important thing is in that sense, Muslims were inside. In that sense, Muslims were not outside of the debates of the revolution. However, then when we come to talk about Muslims themselves, I think it becomes much more complex and much more difficult to see, because of the non-resolution of these questions. Muslims could find ways to be included in revolutionary participation, but I don't think that there was a space in which they were really genuinely able to articulate what it would mean. They often spoke from the evidence that we have, and a student of mine is working on Muslims in India who expressed similar kinds of ideas, to be honest. But they were not given a real space in which they would articulate what it meant to be both Muslim and revolutionary. But I think this is also the case for Jews. And I mean, this is many of the problems that emerged later on is because Jews were asked to really kind of, just be participants when they did eventually have the opportunity to become full participants. There was not a space in which they could articulate these complex questions of belonging.
So one, that was super, super helpful and interesting. In fact, my next question actually gets at the heart of, or is to ask you to expand more on what you describe at one moment as a kind of powerful universalizing logic that you see unfolding, especially in the early debates about non-Catholics and also about the 1789 Declaration. And I guess I would hear more about what it is that you mean by that, universalizing logic, and what does it mean to talk about, a logic on the one hand, and then your account of the kind of competing ideas of universalism, right? Because like to formulate it as a logic is to suggest that there's a kind of some sort of internal dynamic or unfolding at the same time as you also describe it as a kind of site of contestation.
Yes, I mean, I do. I mean, I think there is a logic of universalism, which is that you can't exclude people, that you can't exclude people. The problem is that logic, in a sense, does not work in practice. In practice, there are very complicated questions, right? For actually working out how these values are going to apply. And so this is really the difficulty. Right from the very beginning, they say, the difference between the French Revolution and the American Revolution is going to be that the French Revolution is for all mankind, right? First of all, it's for all the right? But we obviously have this fundamental issue about women and about gender. So it can't, it is not being applied in a universalist sense. And there are those who are taking up those logics. There are women like Olympe de Gouges who are taking up those logics in various kinds of ways, if in kind of halting ways, right? But saying, well, what about this logic, right? This should apply to us too. There are peasants who are saying, well, the logic of this is that, you abolish these kinds of distinctions and you abolish feudalism. And that, but ultimately then you're going to reach points like the conspiracy of equals and Babeuf, who say, well, the logic of this kind of universalism of equality is that, there should be redistribution of economic goods. So these are the problems, right? Universalism has a logic, but in practice, how that logic is to be worked out is profoundly different. And so, yes, sometimes it frustrates me in the contemporary political setting, the way in which revolutionary values of liberty, equality, fraternity are articulated as if they're so easy to, that there are just, if we put them into practice, everything is going to be fine. And then there are those people who accept them or don't accept them. Even those who profoundly and passionately embrace these values deeply disagreed about how they should actually be put into practice. In the question of race too, it should be so obvious that slavery is completely incompatible with both liberty and equality, let alone fraternity. And yet there is a profound difficulty in trying to think about how the world is going to function, how France is going to function on this basis. What I do think I do see through at least the kind of the radical revolutionaries is an unwillingness to legislate inequality. That is the one thing that so on the 24th of December, 1789, there are those who really want the assembly to legislate that Jews can be allowed to be citizens, but only as kind of in a kind of tutelary kind of role, that they will eventually become citizens, but they're going, and the same kind of proposition is put up for people of color and for enslaved people. But ultimately the revolutionaries refused to put that in place. And so that's something that really struck me.
So I guess related to that, I was wondering if you could say more about the particular sort of symbolic resonance and significance that you see in the visual representation of the Muslim, especially the turban, and the invocation of that visible signs of Muslim difference in precisely the articulation of the universalist project of the revolution. And your account really reminded me of Maya Auntie Fernando's discussion in her book on the contemporary context of at once the distinction in the relationship between incommensurable forms of Muslim difference and the idea of the kind of commensurable difference, which she associates with Fadala Amara and the Ni Soumise. And so I guess I was wondering to what extent that was part of the way in which you think about the paradoxical functioning of how to represent the universalism actually requires on some level this marker trace of difference that reproduces it at the same time as it's purportedly over transcending it.
That's a fantastic question. Yes, and I think that's really, really important. I was really struck by my Auntie Fernando's idea about the right to difference, but also the right to indifference. I think that actually shaped me and my thinking about these questions. And you're absolutely right that this is also a profound question, which is in some ways that Muslim difference. And I think Maurice Samuel makes the same kind of argument about Jews, right? That the difference in the revolution itself, that difference becomes actually important for articulating the universalism of the revolution. The question is then, when that difference is no longer there, are those people important? Are they only important because they bring a sign of difference? Coming from a very multicultural, an explicitly multicultural society myself in Australia, signs of difference were often used for very specific kinds of purposes, right? When you're trying to attract overseas students, you would always have explicitly a student wearing a hijab, right? To make it clear that we welcome. But that is also the instrumentalization of difference. And I think for a lot of Muslims in France today, the right to indifference, the right to not be politicized in that sense, is actually really, really important. And so the balance between those two things is really vital. And I guess I was finishing with the story of the and this goes back to your first question about Muslims and citizens. It was pointed out to me at a certain point in the manuscript that there was no example of any Muslim who actually became a citizen. But the only place that I found it was when the rights of citizenship were being withdrawn effectively, right? Where equality was being ruptured. And the normal functioning of Republican citizenship should not inquire as to whether someone is Muslim or not. And so that difference should not appear in the archives. And that is, in a sense, part of the problem of the project, right? But I also think that it's a choice that I made, which is because I think it's extremely important to think about, to think through these things in terms of trying to understand what is done with the revolution today.
So we have, I think, a really related question from the audience about, there's some of the, discussion, at least as I've framed it so far, has been, at the, account of discourses and representations. But one of the things that you're also interested in is the question of embodiment. And I would also note, embodiment and feeling, right? One of the things that that's a kind of thread throughout the book is thinking about the question of feeling as well as discourse. And so do you want to expand on the question of embodiment and feeling and the role that you see it playing?
Yeah, I mean, I was quite struck by the literature on history of emotions, and just how it did help to explain a lot of the political transformations that we see taking place. Certainly the role of enthusiasm. I think I start off the book in the preface with a moment in 2011 when I went to Tunisia, just a couple of months after the revolution there, and just the extraordinary sense of enthusiasm and possibility that was just very broadly felt at that moment. And to understand the power of that feeling, I think that is really crucial to understanding what happens in the early part of the revolution. But this certainly was part of, what I saw as this immense political capital that was gained by Anacharsis Cloots through through this deputation in 1790, in which these very explicit, visually different Muslims participated, and that kind of gestalt of seeing, it did seem to sweep through the members of the assembly and make possible a huge shift, a major shift from, centuries and centuries of French social organization. And that this went really deeply then into what the associations of Muslims then from then on were emotionally with the revolution. And also, the historians like William Reddy have talked about the power of sentimentality in the 18th century. And certainly, if it's not the only kind of emotional code or emotional regime that you see during the revolution, it's certainly a really important one. And, I really did see in a lot of pamphlets and writings around the early part of the revolution, this kind of sentimental fraternity with Muslims that I think becomes quite an important part of trying to think about what the revolution is going to be on the global stage. At the same time, that's a fragile. I mean, I don't think it's not a strong form of relationship, right? I think it's fragile, and it can easily turn into a feeling of being somehow betrayed, or and then can carry quite sort of violent reaction with it.
Right. Well, and I guess that's sort of one of the other, I feel like, big questions that that you're addressing in the book, kind of through the perspective provided by the, seemingly, marginal subject of the question of the Muslim and Islam in the revolution, namely that of sort of continuity and rupture. And there's a way in which clearly we kind of want to make a strong argument for what was for the rupture in certain ways, right? And it seems kind of capture some of the sense of political possibility in these moments. At the same time, there's a way in which, by the time we got to the end of the book, there's a way in which the old images of Muslim incommensurability, right, the figure of the fanatic and the intolerant, cruel Muslim returns through the representation of Robespierre as Muhammad. And so I guess I just wanted to invite you to kind of reflect more on this sort of question of continuity and rupture, and how you see that as also an important part of the argument and contribution of the book.
Yeah, I absolutely think I none of these. Maybe, one of the things that struck me in the book, and one of the things that interested me, was the relative revolutionary embrace of Muslims. And so in some ways, I was interested to explore what that was and what that meant and what possibilities that might actually open. And so I think that was important to me. At the same time, yes, you do see at multiple points through the book the return of other conceptions of Muslims and the associations between Islam and despotism, between Islam and violence, the use, the vilification, the association of associating someone with Islam, right? I have been interested in that in recent times in terms of the kinds of origins of what I see as a much longer discourse about Islamo-gauchisme in France. I don't think you can see quite the same process or kind of metaphorical structure in relation to Robespierre. There are a lot of different vilifications that are being made against Robespierre. It's very, very important at that moment to blame him for everything that has happened in the previous, year or 18 months, and all of the violence that was effectively committed by the state. By the revolutionary state, but the Thermidorians are absolving themselves by blaming Robespierre for it. And the play by Voltaire, the play Muhammad, becomes a really useful script for doing that. I guess it was, in some sense, a kind of forerunner of the ways in which cartoons around the Prophet, caricatures of the Prophet Muhammad, do have a long history of being instrumentalized, right? At the same time, on the other side, you did have this, they would always say, Robespierre was an imposter like the Prophet Muhammad, but not without his genius. So there was always this kind of strange ambiguity in those representations. But certainly, I think, with Napoleon, you do see the return of and new kinds of politicization of Islam in relation to power and authoritarianism. And I guess the kind of, the big takeaway is just that Islam has really been profoundly part of the French political lexicon for really as long as France has existed. Back to the Crusades, right? Before France even came into existence. And we need to recognize that. And that's something that I think, for the next 5 years of Emmanuel Macron's presidency, if we don't want to find the inexorable rise of Marine Le Pen coming, now passing the post and a President Le Pen, then I think we really do need to, French people are going to have to address the questions of the role that Islam is actually playing in French politics.
I guess we have, we're coming up on the end of the hour, but I did have one, I think, sort of related question that you alluded to in your opening remarks. I noticed that you don't actually use or discuss much, either laïcité or secularism or secularity. As it's not the framework that you're using to analyze these discussions. And so I don't know if you kind of want to quickly address that, just because it does seem to once again illuminate to what extent this is a kind of history of the present, and if so, how.
I definitely think there are definitely questions that need to be raised in that regard. And, thinking about the complex genealogy of these ideas is really important. I think it does run through the book, but it is not the principal question that I'm asking in the book, in the sense that the revolutionaries had no conception of laïcité. It was just not on their radar. The question was, what role is the church going to play? What role is religion going to play? And, what is religion, and what are we going to do with religion, right? Is it possible to have a good society, a virtuous society without religion? And what would actually replace it? And that the revolution just does not solve that problem. And perhaps we haven't really, we're still struggling with these questions today. In just about every country in the world, we're struggling with these questions over the role that religion should play. So,
great. And then I see that there's another question, which maybe this can be our last one, about question of physiology. So I guess this is kind of returns this to the issue of embodiment. So maybe thinking about just final reflections on the question of the relationship between race and religion, and the kind of racialization of religion.
Yeah, it's definitely profoundly entangled. These questions, on multiple occasions through the book, I found that racial questions were being interconnected with these questions around religion. I think it just speaks to, I think, we have not recognized the importance of race and the importance of religion really profoundly. Religion in a wider sense, not just the struggle over the church, but religion in a wider sense. I think historians have done a really wonderful work in recognizing that sex and gender were really central to the revolution. They were not just peripheral, secondary questions. They were really central to the ways in which the revolution was understood. And, that work is now being done on race. It's come through the amazing work that's been done on Saint-Domingue, Haiti, and the Haitian Revolution, and the Caribbean, and more now on the Indian Ocean. But, and there's also been, there's obviously been terrific work done on religion, but I think less on the wider sense of religion, and perhaps the religious crisis more widely, if we're thinking about the global revolutionary age and the place that race and religion have within that. So I guess that, what's positive about that is that there's a vast field of inquiry that I think we can and should be investigating for the next generation of researchers that come along.
Well, I think that is perhaps an absolutely fabulous point on which to end, speaking to the many openings and possibilities furnished by your really terrific book, which I recommend to everyone. And I guess Judy, now I'm supposed to thank everyone for coming. Were you going to come in or?
I'm happy to come in and thank you, Ian, for such a great talk. Thank you, Judith, for such great questions. Thank you all for coming. And we start up again in the fall, so we'll hope to see you then. All right.
Well,
thank you, everyone. Have a great summer. Thanks again, Judith. Again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. Bye.
Bye.